A black judge, moments away from presiding over a landmarked racial profiling case, is suddenly profiled herself by the very system she serves. Faced with humiliation on the courthouse steps, what happens next will shake the courtroom and expose a truth far deeper than anyone expected. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Judge Celeste Monroe gripped the steering wheel tightly as the towering Baton Rouge courthouse loomed ahead, bathed in the pale morning sun. The clock on her dashboard flashed mercilessly, 10 minutes until the biggest trial of her career. The silence inside the car was deafening, broken only by the dull hum of traffic outside. Celeste's heartbeat quickened, not from the looming deadline, but from the weight of the day itself. Today wasn't just another case. Today she would oversee a trial that could ripple through every courtroom, every precinct, every household in Louisiana and beyond. The state had long ignored conversations about racial profiling, but this case threatened to drag those uncomfortable truths into the harsh light of public scrutiny. Celeste inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Her reflection in the rearview mirror showed a composed judge, but beneath the polished exterior was a woman carrying the exhaustion of years fighting a system that often saw her as other. She had risen through the ranks with unshakable resolve, yet today felt different. This wasn't just professional, it was personal. The defendant, Marcus Bell, wasn't just another name on a docket. He was every young black man who had ever been wrongfully accused, detained, or silenced, and Celeste knew deep down that today wasn't just about evidence and procedure. It was about dignity. Squaring her shoulders, she stepped out of the car, heels clicking sharply on the pavement. The fight for justice, real justice, was about to begin, and she wasn't sure anyone was truly ready. Celeste opted for the less conspicuous side entrance, steering clear of the chaotic sea of reporters clustered at the grand courthouse steps. Their cameras, microphones, and eager questions could wait. The courtroom could not. Yet, as she rounded the corner, her path was blocked by a young white officer standing rigidly in front of the door. His badge caught the sunlight, but what struck Celeste more was the hardened suspicion in his eyes. Before she could utter a word, he stepped forward. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," he said sharply, his hand resting a little too close to his belt. Celeste blinked, momentarily stunned. Was this happening? Here? Today? She slowly lifted the lanyard from around her neck, presenting her official courthouse badge with quiet authority. "I'm Judge Celeste Monroe. I'm presiding over the Bell case this morning," she stated firmly. But Officer Ryan Beckett didn't even glance at the badge. His cold eyes flickered up and down her figure, sizing her up as if she were a stranger trying to sneak into sacred ground. "There's been an incident nearby," he said, his tone drenched in thinly veiled contempt. "You match the description of someone involved. I'll need you to answer a few questions." Celeste's pulse hammered against her ribs. The bitter irony clawed at her throat. Today, of all days, about to oversee a trial on racial profiling, she was being profiled herself. "Officer," she said, voice tight, "I don't have time for this." She extended her badge again, hoping for reason. But Beckett's hand hovered ominously over the handcuffs clipped to his belt. "I don't care who you say you are," he snapped, stepping closer. "You're coming with me." Celeste's breath caught. This was spiraling, fast. Celeste barely registered the murmurs of officers and courthouse staff as Sergeant Harold Dixon, a veteran of the force with a calm authority honed over decades, intervened just in time. "Stand down, Beckett," he commanded, sharp and unwavering. The young officer flinched, but hesitated. "That's Judge Monroe," Dixon added, voice heavy with reprimand. Ryan Beckett finally stepped aside, jaw clenched, eyes smoldering with wounded pride. Celeste nodded stiffly to Dixon, whispered a strained, "Thank you," and strode inside. But no matter how many steps she took down those marble-floored halls, Celeste could not outrun the sting of what had just happened. The sterile courthouse, with its polished wood and echoes of footsteps, usually offered her a sense of control, but today it felt cold and distant. She moved on instinct, sliding into her robe and mounting the bench, determined not to let the encounter shake her outward composure. Yet beneath the facade, her emotions churned like a storm. When Marcus Bell was called to the stand, Celeste's eyes sharpened. The young man walked stiffly, shoulders hunched under invisible weight. His voice trembled as he described being stopped in his own neighborhood for no reason other than looking suspicious. Celeste leaned forward slightly, every word cutting deeper. His humiliation, his fear, the disbelief, they were hers too. For a moment the courtroom blurred, the cold air thick with unspoken history. Marcus wasn't just a defendant. He was a reflection, and Celeste realized, painfully, that today she wasn't just presiding. She was standing trial too, in her own way. Celeste's fingers instinctively tightened around the gavel when the prosecutor's next words landed like a thunderclap. The state calls Officer Ryan Beckett to the stand. The entire room shifted. Jurors sat straighter, reporters leaned forward, and Celeste could feel the air thicken. Slowly, Officer Beckett walked to the witness box, shoulders squared but eyes betraying the storm within him. When his gaze finally met Celeste's from across the room, she saw recognition. His lips parted slightly as the realization dawned. The woman he had tried to detain was now the very judge presiding over this trial. Celeste masked her expression, but inside, her heartbeat roared. Beckett's confident facade crumbled the moment he was sworn in. His earlier arrogance gave way to nervous glances and shallow breaths. Assistant District Attorney Caroline West, sharp as ever, wasted no time. "Officer Beckett," she began, circling like a hawk, "can you describe the events leading to Mr. Bell's arrest?" Beckett fumbled. He looked out of place, he stammered. He seemed nervous, like he was up to something. A wave of unease swept through the courtroom. Celeste felt her throat tighten. Out of place. The same tired phrase, the coded language she had heard her entire life, standing in for black. Her gavel sat heavy beneath her palm as ADA West pressed on. And what precisely made Mr. Bell look suspicious? What law did he break? Beckett squirmed under the pressure, his voice shrank. We didn't find anything. No crime was committed." The silence that followed was suffocating. Celeste scanned the jury. Some looked shocked, others visibly disturbed. The mask Beckett wore had cracked wide open, and beneath it all that remained was the uncomfortable truth. Celeste's own reflection in this case was no longer a private burden. The entire room could now see it too. As the testimony unraveled, Celeste stole glances at the jury. Their expressions betrayed a quiet struggle, eyes darting between Beckett, Marcus, and the damning facts piling up. Some leaned forward, visibly absorbing the gravity of what was unfolding, while others sat stiffly, conflicted. In the corner of the gallery, reporters scribbled furiously, already sensing the story beneath the surface. But for Celeste, this wasn't about headlines, it was about truth. Ada Caroline West knew it too. Stepping forward with deliberate calm, she fixed her gaze on the jurors. "This isn't just about Marcus Bell," she said, her voice reverberating through the courtroom. "It's about a pattern, one we've seen before, one too many times." The words lingered like smoke, impossible to ignore. Celeste could see the jurors reacting, some nodding subtly, others swallowing hard. But the weight wasn't only on them. Celeste, sitting stoic at the bench, felt it crash against her like a tide. Every detail Marcus shared, every careless assumption Beckett confessed, sounded like an echo of her own life. The courtroom, usually a place where Celeste commanded control, suddenly felt like a mirror, reflecting back decades of personal memories, buried and yet never truly gone. She adjusted her robe, forcing herself to refocus. She had to stay impartial. She was the judge. But inside, something was unraveling. Not her professionalism, but her patience with a system whose cracks were now plain for all to see. The courtroom had long emptied when Celeste finally returned to her chambers, but the echoes of the day clung to her like smoke. She sat motionless behind her desk, staring at the files spread out before her without seeing a word. The knock on her door startled her. "Come in," she called, weary. Sergeant Harold Dixon stepped inside, hat in hand, his face lined with concern and quiet wisdom. He shut the door gently behind him and approached with a humility rarely seen among uniformed officers. "Judge Monroe," he began softly, "I wanted to speak with you about what happened earlier." Celeste leaned back, arms crossed, guarding herself. "Go on," she replied, masking exhaustion with formality. Dixon hesitated, choosing his words with care. "Beckett. He's not evil. He's green, blind to things he should have seen. Like too many, he's been trained to react, not to think." He sighed deeply. "Doesn't excuse it, not for a second, but I've been trying to fix it, from the inside. I know you probably hear that all the time, but I mean it." Celeste's eyes softened only slightly. "Sergeant, I've sat in this chair for years, case after case, story after story, and still, here I am, profiled on the courthouse steps like I was trespassing." Dixon's shoulders slumped, understanding the weight of her words. "I know, and it's not fair, but if you quit holding us accountable, Judge, if you lose hope, we're lost. Change doesn't come overnight, it never does. But piece by piece, it does." Celeste wanted to believe him, to believe that small cracks eventually topple walls, but she also knew that the burden to keep pushing had always rested disproportionately on people like her. Still, hearing it spoken aloud mattered, even if just a little. The following morning, the courthouse felt like it was holding its breath. The usual chatter was absent, replaced by a heavy silence that hung over the building like a storm cloud. Celeste sat alone in her chambers, staring blankly at her coffee as the muffled sounds of reporters, protesters, and curious onlookers seeped through the thick stone walls. Word of the case had spread. It was no longer just local news. The eyes of the nation were now fixed on this courtroom. When Celeste finally stepped into the courtroom, every seat was filled. The gallery was packed with community members, journalists, uniformed officers, and even strangers who had come simply to bear witness. The weight of expectation pressed down on everyone. On one side sat Marcus Bell, his lawyer beside him, gripping the table, bracing himself. On the other sat Officer Ryan Beckett, visibly smaller than the man who had stopped Celeste at the door just yesterday. His eyes shifted nervously, his uniform suddenly looking too crisp, too tight. Celeste scanned the room briefly, settling into the judge's chair like armor. She gave a small nod. "Bring in the jury," she ordered. The double doors creaked open, and the jurors filed in, faces expressionless, betraying nothing. The jury forewoman, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair, held a folded piece of paper like it carried the weight of the world. Celeste's heartbeat pounded in her chest, but didn't show on her face. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked, her voice echoing through the hushed chamber. "We have, Your Honor," the forewoman replied. The pause before the reading was excruciating. The entire room seemed frozen in time, holding onto a breath that no one dared to release. Even Celeste, seasoned and steady, felt the tremor beneath her robe. The forewoman unfolded the verdict with trembling fingers, her voice steady but laced with the weight of the decision. "In the case of Officer Ryan Beckett, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination." For a heartbeat, the room was soundless, as if even the walls were processing the words. Then a ripple spread. Gasps, quiet sobs, shifting bodies. Marcus Bell, seated at the defense table, remained frozen, eyes wide, tears forming but refusing to fall. His attorney reached over, patting his back, but Marcus couldn't move. Relief, disbelief, and exhaustion warred on his face. On the opposite side, Beckett's mouth parted slightly, eyes locked on the jurors as if waiting for them to take it back. But the verdict remained, hanging in the air like a verdict against more than just him. Celeste steadied herself and struck the gavel. "Court is adjourned," she declared. The sound reverberated like thunder. As the gallery stirred and people began filing out, Officer Beckett suddenly stood. "Your Honor," he blurted, voice cracking. The room froze mid-exit. Reporters whipped around. Jurors paused. Even Marcus turned. Celeste's eyes narrowed slightly. "Proceed, Officer Beckett," she said, though her voice betrayed nothing. Beckett's shoulders slumped. Gone was the officer who had blocked her path with arrogant certainty. In his place stood a young man, visibly unraveling. His voice trembled. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting the community, but I was wrong." His throat tightened. "I see now that I let assumptions guide me. I saw Marcus as a threat when he was just existing." His apology hung in the air, brittle and imperfect. Celeste could see the sincerity, but sincerity was not enough. She inhaled deeply before replying, her voice firm but restrained. "Your apology is noted, Officer Beckett, but the harm done, your harm, runs deeper than you realize. It is woven into lives, families, entire communities." She let the words land. Saying sorry doesn't erase that. Beckett nodded faintly, eyes lowered, as if, for the first time, he understood. The courtroom had mostly emptied when Marcus approached, his footsteps soft against the polished floor. Celeste remained seated at the bench, absently organizing papers she wasn't truly reading. She looked up as he neared, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy, layered with everything unsaid. "Judge Monroe," Marcus began, his voice hoarse from days of tension. His eyes still shimmered with emotion, but his tone held steady. I wanted to thank you." Celeste blinked, caught slightly off guard. "You don't need to thank me," she replied, shaking her head gently. "I was just doing my job." Marcus swallowed and stepped a little closer. "No," he said, quietly but firmly. "It was more than that. You listened. You saw me, not just as a name on a file, but as a person. This wasn't just about me today. It was about all of us who get stopped, humiliated, forgotten." His voice wavered, but he stood tall. "You gave me a voice." Celeste's composure threatened to crack. The words she'd tried so hard to keep inside pressed against her throat. Marcus, young and battered by the system, was still standing, still fighting to be seen. She nodded slowly. "I hope this is a step toward change," she said, careful to keep her voice calm, though it trembled slightly at the edges. "But remember, it's just one case. There is still a long road ahead." Marcus gave a small, knowing smile. "I know," he said softly, "but it's a start, and that means something." Celeste watched as he turned and walked away, his shoulders no longer sagging but squared, carrying not just the weight of what he endured, but the hope of what might come next. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the courthouse as Celeste slipped quietly through the side door, hoping to avoid the storm of reporters waiting at the front. But as soon as the door creaked open, there he stood, Officer Ryan Beckett, leaning against the brick wall like a man who had aged years in a single day. His uniform hung on him awkwardly, his posture slack, as if the verdict itself had drained the life from him. Celeste froze, her instinct telling her to keep walking, to spare herself whatever hollow excuse might follow. But something in Beckett's expression gave her pause. His eyes were no longer defensive or angry. They were simply lost. "Judge Monroe," he began, straightening awkwardly. His voice was hoarse. "I didn't expect to see you." He fidgeted, searching for words. "I've been thinking. About today, about you, about Marcus." Celeste said nothing, folding her arms, letting the silence force him to confront his own discomfort. "I know sorry isn't enough," Beckett finally said, his voice cracking under the weight of the truth. "It won't fix what I did, what I almost did to you, or what I did to him. But I didn't mean for it to happen." Celeste's eyes narrowed. She had heard this line far too many times. Her voice was steady but sharp. "You didn't mean for it to happen," she repeated. "Officer Beckett, it always happens. That's the problem." She took a step closer. It's not about intent, it's about impact. Beckett looked down, ashamed. He didn't argue. He didn't try to defend himself. For a flicker of a moment, Celeste almost pitied him. Almost. But she knew better. Change wasn't born out of pity. It came from truth, accountability, and action. Celeste stepped back inside the courthouse, her heels echoing through the now quiet hallways. The day's events clung to her like the humid Louisiana air, heavy and suffocating. Just ahead, Sergeant Dixon was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching her approach. He gave a small nod, eyes knowing. "Piece by piece, Judge," he said softly. Celeste exhaled, the phrase settling deep within her. Piece by piece. It sounded so simple, almost naive, yet today she had seen it. A sliver of accountability, a ripple of truth breaking through the surface. She thought of Marcus walking out of that courtroom taller than when he entered, of the jury finally saying what so many had been waiting to hear, and even of Beckett, standing on the other side of his own reckoning. But Celeste also knew this wasn't the finish line. For every Marcus Bell who would get a verdict, countless others would not. For every courtroom where truth found its voice, there would be others where it remained strangled by bias, indifference, or fear. She returned to her chambers, closing the door behind her but leaving it slightly ajar. A small gesture, almost instinctive. The fight wasn't over, and deep down she knew it never would be. Yet in the stillness of that moment, beneath the fatigue, a fragile hope flickered. Maybe, just maybe, piece by piece, wasn't just a tired saying. Maybe it was the only way forward. This story reminds us that injustice isn't always loud. Sometimes it hides in routine moments, like a courthouse doorway or a neighborhood sidewalk. Judge Celeste Monroe's experience reflects what many still face today: the painful reality that titles, achievements, or good intentions are often no match for ingrained bias. Yet, it also shows us that change is possible, even if it comes slowly, piece by piece. Each conversation, each act of accountability, each step toward justice matters. Stories like Marcus Bell's and Celeste's are not just courtroom dramas. They are everyday realities for countless people. And it is up to all of us in our communities, workplaces, and homes to confront these patterns and push for change. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others. Together we can keep this conversation alive.